All right, great. Thanks, Jolie. All right, well, welcome everybody to the discussion. As Jolie said, I'm Lauren McGrath. I'm the director of the Watershed Protection Program at Willistown Conservation Trust. So before we get too far into the discussion, I do want to share a little bit about my organization. We are a small land trust located in southeastern Pennsylvania, in southern Chester County and northern Delaware County. And while we are a traditional land trust focused on protecting and maintaining open space, our main goal is to connect people to the landscape by building meaningful connections through a number of different program areas. And our programs include habitat stewardship, regenerative agriculture, which takes place at Rushton Woods Preserve, where we have a 6-acre organic farm, watershed protection program, which I'm representing tonight, and our bird conservation program, which is focused on learning more about migration of songbirds in the spring and fall, as well as saw-whet owls in the fall. We have volunteer opportunities all the time. To learn more and get involved with our organization, please feel free to visit wctrust.org. And I'm also a member of DCVA, and I don't have a slide for DCVA, but if you want to learn more about the amazing work happening in the Darby Creek Valley Watershed Association, that website is dcva.org as well. So let's talk about lawns. And I want to start first and foremost really emphasizing that this talk is really to be informative and not to shame anybody about their preference or aesthetic. Everyone approaches their landscape and their home very differently. So I'm hoping that no matter what your kind of preference is for the area around your home, that we can find sustainable ways for you to accomplish your visual goals. So how did we get to this space where we see a lush monoculture trimmed field and think, yeah, that's where I really want to live? Right, lawns are ubiquitous in our landscape, and it's a pretty unusual feature if you really stop to think about it. And when I say ubiquitous, American residential lawns take up 49,000 square miles, which is an area equal in size to the country of Greece, or approximately, I think it was Pennsylvania and Ohio together is just lawn in the continental US. And when you expand that beyond lawn to include anything that is just turf grass, so like athletic fields, parks, and other maintained turf grass areas, that expands to be over 62,500 square miles in the continental US alone. That's approximately 2% of our landscape is made up just of grasses. That's 3 times more than any irrigated crop. And that's really important when we're talking about this vast scope, because unlike irrigated crops, there's no benefit or food production to lawns. It's really just an aesthetic planting that we maintain. But it is a really, really massive, massive portion of our landscape. And it accounts for over half of homeowner use in some states. So California, water use can be between 60 and 70% of the household's consumption just for maintaining a green lawn. Residential lawns require more irrigation than any crop, but we don't consume anything produced in a traditional lawn, right? It's just turf grass. We also consume 80 million pounds of fertilizers and pesticides on our lawns each year as Americans. And that is a $60 billion industry per year. And this number fluctuates pretty dramatically from year to year, depending on rainfall rates and things of that nature. But suffice to say that the maintenance of our lawn is a huge portion of the money that we spend as Americans. So how did we get to this place where we obsess so much over the beauty and sorry, I'm having some Zoom issues on my end. We got to this place of just obsessing over this monochromatic green carpet of lush lawn over a very long period of time. So lawns as status symbols date all the way back to French and English aristocracies in the late Middle Ages. And what originated as a tactical maintenance of the landscape, so you could see from your fortress or building, right? When soldiers were approaching on foot, you had to maintain the grass at a shorter level and be sure that it was clear of trees. But that transformed over a long period of time to be an opulent display of wealth, because these yards and lawns were being maintained by small armies of people with scythes, hand removing unwanted plants. It took a lot of excess time, energy, and funding to be able to show off a lawn. And this extends back to the origins of the United States. So early on, after the United States was established as a country, a number of different designers and landscape engineers came together and started creating designs that truly epitomized democracy in the landscape. So rather than traditional European backyards or front yards that would be delineated by fences or stone walls, rather they wanted to portray this sense of community by having houses scattered across an unbroken carpet of grass like a park. And this was really captured really nicely by Frank J. Scott, who literally wrote the book on lawns in 1870. And he says, a smooth, closely shaven surface of grass is by far the most essential element of beauty on the grounds of a suburban house. Let your lawn be your home's velvet robe, and your flowers its not too promiscuous decoration. And I thought this it was just so fantastic, because you don't want to be too showy, but you do want to show that you are heavily investing in maintaining the landscape surrounding your home. So one of the big events that actually really spurred the rapid spread of lawns and this necessity for a green, unbroken landscape came after World War II. So the market was suddenly filled with excess nitrogen, which was available at low cost and was being marketed towards homeowners as a way to get that perfect lawn that you are now starting to see on color televisions. So as color TVs spread throughout the country and became more affordable and accessible, so did this idealization of lawns as actually being reflective of character traits. So a well-maintained lawn showed that you had a strong work ethic, you had good family values, and you had respect for neighbors and property values. Whereas an unkept lawn suggested that you are an unruly neighbor, you know, your home life might be a bit of a mess, you don't respect your neighbors. And this is actually a really common trope used. So this is a screenshot from the mid-2000s TV show Malcolm in the Middle. And they never addressed the fact that this family who stars in the sitcom, that their lawn is not maintained. But upon watching the opening scenes, you already have that bias that this family is a bit of a mess. When you see this kind of messy, unkept, unwatered lawn, sandwiched in by these beautifully maintained, perfect green landscapes. So that's kind of some of the psychology right behind it. There's a lot that we identify in ourselves reflected in the landscapes that we maintain. A lot of this has been created and marketed to us for a very long time. So the chemical boom, which I already kind of alluded to with this excess nitrogen post World War II, really led to a strong marketing campaign to just sell this excess of nitrogen to be used. So what's interesting is very quickly it was noted that excess use of nutrient application led to very quickly eutrophication in lakes. And this was documented in Chautauqua Lake in 1955. So eutrophication is the rapid growth in an aquatic ecosystem. So usually you see, you know, a lot of algal growth happening very quickly, and then the rapid death of the algae consumes all of the oxygen, leading to very dangerous living conditions for other aquatic animals. So oftentimes you'll see a lot of algae and dead fish in the media when there's a eutrophication event in a public space. So what's really interesting about this Chautauqua Lake situation was that it was identified that it was excess nitrogen causing the eutrophication, but rather than reduce the application of nitrogen, the communities thought that it would just be best to dump herbicides into the lake and not alter the nitrogen application. So effectively just killing the entire lake for a period of time. But the pesticides or herbicides were thought to have stifled the algal growth. So you could keep your green lawns and keep your lake blue. Very quickly from 1949 to 1950 to 1964, the non-farm fertilizer market was worth well over 300 million. So it was a really rapidly growing market. So unfortunately, the impact of non-farm fertilizer and pesticide use really wasn't being handled early on. The water quality regulations of the 1970s and 1980s really focused on point source pollution. So what was coming right out of the pipe into the waterways. And through a lot of proactive work and regulation, that point source pollution was well monitored and maintained, and we saw really rapid improvements in water quality across the country. But unfortunately, this non-point source pollution, like what's washing off of individual lawns, is much harder to track. So some of the information about how much we are actually contributing from our yards is a little fuzzy and hard to nail down, because it is so variable from person to person and yard to yard. And I do want to draw some attention to fertilizers, because I just painted a very negative picture. And fertilizers are actually very important for the health of our soils, for the health of our plants, but there's some little tweaks I want to point out to you. So the main components of fertilizers include nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. But the lawn fertilizer market is generally dominated by nitrogen-rich inorganic fertilizers. So fertilizers can be classified as inorganic or mineral, which really focus on feeding the plant. So inorganic fertilizers are great for crop production in poor soils where you really want to get a lot of food quickly off of a plant. However, organic fertilizers are really more beneficial to enriching the soil and providing a healthier environment for the plants to grow in. So that the synthetic, mineral, or inorganic fertilizers are really what we're targeting during this discussion, because it's very, very easy to over apply inorganic fertilizers to your lawn. And those really bioavailable fertilizers that are generally a little bit lower in abundance in the natural ecosystem can cause a lot of problems to the waterways if they wash directly in, right? You can see that eutrophication take place pretty quickly. So as I am talking about the fertilizers, I'm really focusing on those synthetic fertilizers and not so much the organic fertilizers. So just a point of clarification. To quickly shift gears a little bit, I wanted to share a little bit about pesticides and herbicides. We use a lot of pesticides or herbicides on our lawns to be sure that we are really maintaining that monoculture of grass and not having things like dandelions or thistles popping up where we don't want them. It's really, I was just at Home Depot today. I saw a whole section of weed and feed lawn treatment that you could buy. And so this is where you combine the fertilizers and the herbicides. So you're killing the plant that you don't want and really feeding the plants that you do want. And it is an elegant system when applied properly. The most commonly applied herbicides include 2,4-dichlorophenoxytic acid, or 2,4-D, glyphosate, which is the active ingredient in Roundup, and atrazine, which is less commonly used on lawns and more often used in agricultural fields, but it's not unheard of to apply atrazine to your property. And all of these are considered broadleaf herbicides, which means that they have a negative impact on non-grass plants. So I do want to share that the exposure to all of these chemicals has been linked to certain cancers in humans and other mammals, including pets, like your cat or your dog. There's a huge field of emerging research really focusing on understanding the interactions of these chemicals in the human body, because it's not very clearly understood, and the rate of chemical development far outpaces the rate of kind of clinical studying, which is always going to be one of the risks with chemical work. So I want to take a second to really focus in on glyphosates, because this is by far the most commonly used herbicide applied to households. So it's the active ingredient in Roundup, as well as over 750 other herbicides. And there is evidence of glyphosate toxicity to humans at concentrations far lower than what regulations deem safe. But again, this is kind of emergent research. And I will say the World Health Organization's cancer authorities, known as the International Agency for Research on Cancer, did determine that glyphosate is probably carcinogenic, all the way back in 2015. And I do like the WHO's research, because they do not take any funding from potentially biased funders like the producer of Roundup. And they are pretty proactive with their research. But it's amazing that over 5 million or so pounds is applied by homeowners annually. I saw probably 7 different types of glyphosates for sale at my local Home Depot when I was there today. So it's really accessible and available, but there's not necessarily the education around how to safely apply these chemicals to your home that's readily accessible to a layperson. Sometimes these websites feel like you really need a PhD in biochemistry to understand what's going on. So more directly tied to water, glyphosates are commonly listed as a water-safe herbicide, and this is clever marketing, and it's not true. There have been dozens of studies at this point showing that impacts of glyphosates in the aquatic communities are severe. So the stream macroinvertebrate communities, which typically includes larval forms of many insects and things like freshwater mussels that should be living in the waterways in this region, are really negatively impacted by the application of glyphosate. So you can see decreases in biodiversity with sensitive indicator species vanishing first, and then reduced larval growth in a lot of different varieties of stream life. And that's really important, because that decreased larval growth is correlated with decreased adult success. So smaller baby insects grow into smaller adults, which lay fewer eggs and have lower success rates. So you can see a long-term destabilization of communities in the aquatic system when glyphosate is applied in surrounding environments. It is directly toxic to amphibians, and amphibians like salamanders and frogs are oftentimes very early indicators of chemical contamination, because they absorb so much through their skin. That's how they breathe. They're very high risk for negative impact from novel chemical application. Something that's really interesting, a number of articles have suggested that Roundup is actually more toxic to stream life than glyphosate alone. And this is where some of the research gets a little tricky, because Roundup has a number of other chemicals included in it. So trying to tease apart what exactly is causing that higher mortality rate is really interesting. There's a lot of work being done kind of looking into those questions. So Permethrin is a pesticide. It's used for treating yards for ticks and mosquitoes, and it's part of a larger school of chemicals, all which are considered highly toxic to both freshwater and estuarine organisms. So almost all of the models that were presented in the papers that I was looking at suggested that the concentration that's considered safe is actually incredibly deadly to freshwater and estuarine fish, invertebrates, and organisms living in the sediment, which is concerning because it is commonly, it's a pretty commonly applied chemical to many yards, and it's incredibly toxic to honeybees. So there is a sister chemical to permethrin, which was recently banned globally. I believe it's called fibabril. I might be butchering that name a little bit. But it is well known to be dangerous, right? It is designed to kill insects, and so it does its job very, very effectively, whether it's on land or in the water. So in case you were curious, there are a ton of very accessible resources online that you can look to see if the chemicals that you maybe are considering or are looking into hiring a lawn care service that might be considering using chemical treatments on your lawn. You can look and see each of the red X's in this chart is followed by a number of letters, or a number of numbers, pardon. And each of those numbers is a study that was conducted independently, looking at the toxicity of the herbicides, insecticides, and fungicides, which are all listed in the leftmost column. And they look to see what the toxicity was in a number of different scenarios. So if it's in the groundwater, if it leaches from the soil, if it's toxic to birds, toxic to fish or aquatic organisms, toxic to bees, or toxic to mammals. So you can see that studies have found that these chemicals designed to kill specific things actually have kind of a wider ripple effect. And I will say I am not a chemist. I am an aquatic biologist, so I can't say specifically to some of the details of these papers, but if you're curious, there's a lot of information online from non-biased sources to learn more about, what you might be putting on your lawn. And I really would encourage you to do some of that research, because you could be making a choice that would directly benefit or negatively impact the watershed in your area. So that was a lot of really kind of negative downer information very quickly, and I apologize for that, but I did want to provide a lot of base information for the discussion afterwards. So something that's really interesting and that we don't really celebrate enough, right, is the ability of our soils to absorb water. This is really, really important, because all of the rain that falls in a watershed, right, in the area of land surrounding a common waterway, it has to go somewhere. And something that's really fascinating is that lawns can actually act the same way as concrete or pavement in certain cases. So any surface that does not allow for water to pass through is called impervious. And an impervious surface can make a really big difference in the watershed. So we commonly think of impervious surfaces as things like rooftops, roadways, parking lots, but actually lawns can act as an impervious surface. So when you have a lot of large machinery moving land and compacting and leveling during construction, then you lay a carpet of turf grass on top. what can happen is when rainfall hits that grass, it can't go any further and it just runs right off into the closest water body. So it's really kind of this interesting idea, right? That 2% of the landscape in the United States is made of lawns, and probably just shy of 2% of that lawn is acting as impervious surface. So grass, turf grass particularly, is not very good at breaking up dense soil. So a common rule of thumb is that grass roots grow to about half the length of the blade. So if you are mowing your grass at a tight 1 inch all summer long, the root bundle underneath is only going to be half an inch. So it creates this really intricate and intense tiny root system, which is not effective at absorbing water from the soil. It kind of just sits on top of the soil, right? You can roll turf grass up like carpet. So when we shift, right, from thinking just about our lawns as areas for turf grass and start thinking of it as maybe some space for native plants, we can begin to break up that really tightly compacted soil. Like if you live in a new development or in an area that has had earth moved for whatever reason, the grass is not going to be able to loosen up that soil by itself. But if you intersperse some of these native plants with much more robust root systems, you're going to see a very big difference in how your lawn handles rainstorms. And so we can, this is one of my absolute favorite diagrams. On the left is turf grass, and then to the right are a number of different native plants. This is focused on prairie communities, but many of our plants in the mid-Atlantic through New England have very similar root structures. So by interspersing your lawn with native plants, you can actually start to see a decrease in the need for watering your lawn, as well as see that more of the rain that falls on your property is being absorbed into the soil rather than running off. So let's talk about how to be a good streamside neighbor. Something that might not be surprising, my very first recommendation is going to be start thinking about native plants. I know that people have a wide range of abilities, a wide range of funding to consider landscaping on their property. But it doesn't take a lot to start making a big difference. Planting even 1 or 2 native plants in your yard, you know, along the edge of your driveway can make a really big difference in the watershed. If everyone in your community planted 1 or 2 plants, that might have a really big compounded impact over time. And there are a lot of beautiful plants that you can find to substitute from, you know, maybe those flats that you could pick up from Home Depot. Another alternative is to think about letting your grass grow just a little longer and altering your mowing schedule to let that grass grow out a little bit, right? Because if the roots are growing to half the length of the blade, if you allow your grass to grow to 2 inches instead of 1, that's doubling the amount of depth that those roots can reach. That's going to help with your watering schedule, your mowing schedule, maybe reclaim a couple of hours every weekend. And of course, I do want to recommend that you, if you are doing your own mowing, make sure you check with your township if there are any, you know, recommendations or restrictions from your township on how long your grass can grow, or if you have a homeowners association, to check with them to be sure that you're not accidentally opening yourself up for a fine. So if you or your landscape or lawn care company is considering using fertilizers, try to reduce or stop the use of inorganic fertilizers whenever possible. You can consider switching to the more organic fertilizers, right? Those additives that feed the soil as well as the plant. So this can include things like compost and manure that are really rapidly integrated into the soil and improve the texture, quality, of that dirt, right, to provide more to those plants rather than just feeding the plant on the surface level. But, you know, if you do want to maintain that lush lawn, an organic fertilizer might help you achieve that goal without having some of those more potential risks associated with the inorganic fertilizers. Always apply on cool spring days when the temperature is between 60 and 70 degrees Fahrenheit. Read the label is so important. Many fertilizers have recommendations on temperature ranges. Usually the cool is better, but you want the plants to be ready to uptake whatever additives you're putting onto your lawn. So if it's too hot or too cold, you run the risk of plants not absorbing those fertilizers and it running off in the next rainstorm, which brings me to my next point. Do not apply fertilizers if it's about to storm. Check your long range forecast. Give your plants in your yard time to take up all of these additives. You're literally washing money down the drain if you apply any fertilizers or other chemicals to your yard right before a rainstorm. When considering using pesticides or herbicides, the first recommendation is, of course, don't. But we know that that's not an option for everybody. And you know, the aesthetic that you have for your property is very personal. So if you are considering using these chemicals, then potentially think about organic alternatives, like hand removal of pest plants that you don't want. But knowing that not everybody is able to dedicate the time or have the physical mobility to hand remove pest plants from their lawn, consider using some organic weed killers like vinegar or corn gluten. For every plant that you don't want in your yard, there is at least 5 websites recommending different organic ways to remove those without the use of chemical pesticides or herbicides. And then, of course, carefully read the label. Oftentimes, when you purchase an herbicide, it comes as a concentrate and there's a dilution that has to be done. So definitely check to be sure that you're following all safety guidelines and that you're diluting anything that needs to be diluted, so you're not putting concentrate on your yard where you might run the risk of burning plants that you would like to keep and maintain. And just like with fertilizers, check the weather carefully to be sure that there's not a big rainstorm coming, so you don't wash anything down the drain, right? There's usually for pesticides and herbicides specific temperature ranges for effective application. So always check to be sure that, you know, it's not going to be 95 degrees and stormy tonight, you know, after you've applied all of your applications. And consider a spot treatment rather than like a spray treatment. The Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture is an amazing resource for learning when it's appropriate to do spot treatments versus spray treatments. And it has a lot of really wonderful information on some of the more specific chemicals and safety measures that you should be taking. So if you don't do your own maintenance, we put together kind of some questions to ask your lawn care professionals. So asking, what kinds of chemicals are you applying to my lawn? And what is the purpose of the application of these chemicals? Oftentimes, lawn care professionals are made of teams, and a person might be making recommendations to the team, and they're on a schedule to go to X, Y, and Z properties. So checking in with whoever is working on your property to make sure that they're familiar with what the application protocol is for your specific home is really helpful. When and how often are you applying these chemicals? Did you check the weather forecast, or are you on a set schedule and you have to hit all 85 houses on your route by the end of the week? Starting an open and honest dialogue with the people that you're paying to help maintain your property is really, really beneficial in the long run. Be sure that you're getting the results that you want and they're clear with where your values lie. And is there a certified applicator on site during application? So for many herbicides and pesticide applicators, or companies, there has to be someone on the team with the certification. So they don't necessarily have to be present on site when the application is taking place, but they are responsible for the safety training of their team. So checking in to see who's got the certification, who do I call if I have issues is really helpful in answering a lot of these questions and making sure that you're comfortable and confident with the treatment that the property is receiving. So that kind of brings us to the end of the discussion lecture portion of the talk. So again, my name is Lauren. I'm with Willistown Conservation Trust, and I do want to encourage you to visit dcva.org to learn more about the amazing efforts of the Darby Creek Valley Watershed Association and their work in the Darby Creek watershed. So I'm going to end the presentation and open the discussion. Hopefully, I didn't lose you all. I know that was a lot in a very short period of time. But I'm here to have a bit of a dialogue, and I hope that all made sense and was educational. But are there any questions? So if not, I'm just gonna out myself that I have a lawn that we only mow portions of. And when I purchased my home, we made this decision, right, that we were going to be a chemical-free household, which was very, very different than the previous homeowners. And one of the quick realizations that we had was that it was on us to do some education for our neighbors who were not sure what we were up to. So we got a lot of questions right at the beginning, like, is your lawnmower broken? Do you need to borrow mine? Very thoughtful and kind questions from caring neighbors. And we kind of brought our whole community along with us in kind of learning more about the plants that we were putting in our yard, why we weren't mowing every weekend. And it led to a really interesting phenomenon with our neighbors starting to alter their mowing regimens a little bit because they wanted to reclaim their hours on the weekend. And we've seen a really big change happen with more birds utilizing our property, more pollinators. We see tons of monarch butterflies now because of the milkweed that myself and my neighbors on both sides have all planted in our yards. So I think if you're considering maybe changing how you're maintaining your property, talk to your neighbors first, because oftentimes, right, we've been trained to perceive that green yard as being a good thing, a reflective of our own personal ethic and values. So starting the conversation early with your neighbors might help avoid some of those awkward conversations, because we do have a mower, we just don't use it.
Actually, Lauren, I have a question. With the areas that you do have that would be deemed your typical everyday grass area, I mean, you still have that, you just let it grow longer?
We do, yeah. So we mow it at probably 3 inches. So it's a little shaggy looking for sure. It's full of flowers, and I call them flowers and not weeds because I personally really like dandelions. But yeah, so we do mow it, but we're letting all of those plants just kind of take over. But I don't personally love living in a field, especially because of, issues with ticks and things like that. We do have pets. So our goal really was to increase the ability of our soil to permeate. By the time we're done living on this property, I anticipate the entire thing being a meadow. But that takes a really long time and a lot of investment and effort. So right now we have a small meadowed area, a portion that we maintain as lawn, and a section that's heavily wooded that we just kind of leave alone.
Do you have a seed mix that you would recommend, or type of seed mix?
Good question. I got my seed mix from Ernst, ERNST. They have an amazing, amazing variety of seeds that you can look to see native mixes for your specific area that will work. So if you're in a damp area versus, you know, a sunny edge habitat, Ernst has the mix for you. So for us, we got a partial shade wetland seed mix, and it's been
And
in
really,
quite nice.
Okay.
really helpful
Thank
on the phone when you call them. If you tell them what you want and what you're looking for with your property, Ernst will really give you good advice.
What do you do if you're clueless of what you need?
You can ask.
Yeah.
There are, so I would say you could call Ernst and describe what your situation is, what your property is like, or you could go to, we are very fortunate to have a number of native plant nurseries near in our area. So you could go and talk to a person, bring pictures, describe your property, and they're almost always very excited to give recommendations on not only what plants to plant, but where to plant them and how to maintain them. So that might be a good place to start. And in your region, Sue, I think maybe Redbud, that's usually where I go.
Yeah, that's where I normally go also.
I had really bad luck with redbud.
Oh, really?
Yes, I got natives of the inkberry because we had a hedge of boxwood and it croaked. So I got about 30 plants of the inkberry, and they were kind of leggy, but we planted them and we mulched them in really well last year during the COVID, and we lost one, and they would not stand by their material.
Really?
Oh,
They said that's your problem. They really put it right back in my face. And I said, you're not going to do I emailed them back, you're not going to do very well in this area because the word will get out that you don't stand behind your plant material. For a year, they should do that.
That's a shame to hear. I know they're under new management now.
Yeah, she was really good, the woman who was there in the beginning.
Catherine, yeah.
This gay couple, and I don't think they're carrying on the mission.
Well, that's a shame to hear. I'm so sorry that you had bad luck with them.
So am I, because I liked it. She sold us some really wonderful little teeny beech trees, and they've grown up to be so big. Yeah, she's had some really great things.
Yeah, I haven't had any experience with the new owners, but I was planning on stopping by this weekend. So
what are some other, you said we had a lot in our area. What are some other native plant places?
oh, okay. So there is, I should have written down a list. So there's Octoraro Nursery and Octoraro Wholesale. So I think the nursery is a little further west, but I believe they will sell individual plants. There are a number of groups this time of year that will do native plant sales. So I know, I think is it the Schuylkill Center has a huge plant sale. Land Health.
Yeah, Radnor Conservancy is having one on May 22nd.
Perfect. Thanks, Sue.
Thank you.
And oftentimes they're locally sourced seeds that are then germinated and sold. So, you know, if possible, and this requires a little bit of research and digging with your seller, seeing where those seeds are sourced and keeping within a certain distance of your home can really guarantee that like you have the plants that will work for you. So sometimes with bigger companies like, you know, the Home Depots and Lowe's, they'll source native plants that are grown in upstate New York or from, you know, North Carolina that technically grow in our region, but were developed from stock that have a very different tolerance. So maintaining, it's about 30 miles is what we try to do whenever possible. It can be challenging. But yeah, I can generate a better list to share after the talk with you. It's the end of a long day, so my brain isn't great at grabbing some of that new information.
Jenkins Arboretum also has nice plants that they sell. You know that Jenkins Arboretum in Devon.
I love Jenkins. Yeah, thanks, Ron.